Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Today we've got a brand new story to share with you, so let's begin. Edward Bishop was born in a small, struggling farming community in eastern Oregon, where his family's story was anything but idyllic. His father, Alastair, had inherited a modest parcel of land from his grandfather. With a burst of youthful optimism, Alastair convinced his wife, Marlene, to move there and build a life as farmers. Unfortunately, farming wasn't Alastair's calling. The only things he managed to cultivate were debts and frustration. Eventually, he left Marlene for a waitress from a bar, one not too different from the one Edward found himself sitting in now. Marlene, unwilling to stay in a dead-end situation, took 7-year-old Edward and moved to Portland. She divorced Alastair but chose to keep Edward's surname as a reminder of his father's legacy, for better or worse. In Portland, Marlene took a job as a receptionist and administrative assistant at a downtown bank to make ends meet. Determined to pursue her lifelong dream of becoming a nurse, she enrolled in classes at PSU, balancing work, study, and motherhood with quiet resilience. Unfortunately, life had other plans. When Edward was 10, tragedy struck. On her way to work one morning, Marlene's car was broadsided by a truck on the bridge. The impact sent her vehicle over the railing and into the water below. Took a full day to recover her body. She hadn't been wearing a seatbelt. Just like that, her life was over and Edward's world was turned upside down. With no immediate family to take him in, Edward was thrust into the foster care system. For the next 7 years, he drifted through a series of homes along the Portland-Salem corridor, each one more temporary than the last. Stability was a distant dream. He developed a knack for survival, though it often got him into trouble. Fights became routine, and petty thefts added to his growing reputation as a troubled kid. It all reached a breaking point when Edward turned 17, forcing him to confront the path his life was hurtling down. Ever since the death of his mother, whom he had loved deeply, Edward had felt alone and empty. In an attempt to fill that emptiness within himself, he joined various gangs and took to the lifestyle like a duck to water. It didn't fill the emptiness, didn't even come close, but while he was with them, he could pretend like he was part of something larger, something beyond himself. The criminal acts, the drugs, the stealing of merchandise, none of that stuff was all that important. It was merely the outward show of solidarity you took away with you. Yeah man, we're together in all this, and we always will be. It wasn't the acts themselves that were important. It was the spirit behind them. Doing things as a gang and getting away with it, drawing the bonds of loyalty and solidarity even tighter. Well, that's what he told himself anyway. Even though his less than educated mind couldn't articulate the concepts, that was what he felt. Until he was 17, he and the guys had decided it would be a good idea to burn down the police station. Not a smart move in retrospect, but hell what the hell, it'd be a blast, right? Well, the cops that caught them didn't see the humor in the situation, so they were all packed up and sent off to jail until they were 21. Jail taught him things. It wasn't at all like in the movies, but it wasn't that great either. Edward quickly got status, and he got respect when word got out that he was in there for burning down a police station. He did his time, got out with a few scars, and started bumming all over the Pacific Northwest looking for odd jobs. Edward always laughed when he saw stories in the paper about work being hard to find, and when he saw stories on the news about the unemployment rate being so high. Jobs were all over the place. The real problem was that nobody wanted to get their hands dirty doing them. Edward might have been a criminal, but he wasn't averse to hard work. Not at all. Hell, he liked spending money as much as the next guy. So, it was over to Eastern Washington to pick apples, up to Seattle to work in the fish market, down to Pendleton to work on the ranches, lots of dirty backbreaking work, but it was honest work and he always had some cash. And he laughed at all the out-of-work white-collar idiots who bitched and moaned on the TV about there being no work, while he nursed blisters on his hands from digging fence post holes that carried him for the next 10 years, right up until about 1995. And it was the goddamnedest piece of good luck that ended it for him. He was walking along a country road in central Washington and had come across a damn fine-looking sports car stranded on the side of the road. Smoke raftered up from the tailpipe in thick clouds and steam gushed from under the hood. And standing next to it was the sexiest woman he had ever seen in his life. "Looks like you got a problem there, ma'am," Edward said, standing far enough away so that he wasn't perceived as a threat. The woman jumped and turned, hands going up a little defensively before she saw that he was at a safe distance. "Yeah, something went bang under the hood and I stalled out. I'm on my way to Wenatchee and I think I got turned around." Edward laughed. "You sure did. It's off that way and you're heading the complete opposite direction." The woman smiled ruefully. "I was never any great shakes at navigation. Want me to look under the hood there for you?" She studied him for a moment. "Do I have to be worried about you?" "Not today," Edward said, trying to look harmless. "Not easy when you're a big bruiser with red hands and 3 days' growth of beard." But he did try, and it seemed to work because she eventually let him look under the hood. To cut a long story short, he fixed her broken pistons and she fixed his wandering life. All those years on the road had made Edward fairly well acquainted with the female body and all its wondrous permutations, but nobody turned over his motor like Laura Parker did. They dated for a year before they got married. She was insatiable. Laura's father owned a construction company and, in an ironic twist of fate, it turned out that Edward had done work for one of Old Man Parker's crews before, and they told the old man that he was reliable and always got the job done. So Edward hired on there, first as a plain old carpenter and then later as a foreman, and later still he was helping expand the business in the front office. He and Laura married a year after that initial meeting on that dusty road, and they never looked back. Things coasted along for the next 10 years. Edward was fat, dumb, and happy, and he had no idea things were anything but peachy keen. Money was rolling in from the business. Laura's father had retired and Edward was running the thing single-handedly by 2000, and they were trying for kids but not having much luck, and then an overheard conversation changed it all. Now, sitting at Sammy's Roadhouse and nursing his beer, Edward thought back to the day, just 2 days ago, when he first realized his Laura was a cheating 304. It was an ordinary day, as so many days when momentous events occur are. Edward got up, made love to his wife, had a shower, drank his coffee, kissed his wife goodbye and headed for the office tower his construction business was based out of. It had sure come a long way from the old rundown trailer it had started out in. Things went along until about 10 in the morning when Edward got up to get a cup of coffee from the break room. He was just about to step through the door when the sound of his wife's name stopped him cold in the hallway. "Does Edward know about Laura?" came the voice of Jim Fredericks, a roofer Edward worked with. A laugh. "Not hardly. You'd think he'd put up with it if he did," answered Ralph Billings, one of their subcontractors. "Good point. So who's she doing now?" "I think she's got Jack Sullivan over tomorrow. Boss says he's going out of town to Portland." Another laugh from Ralph. "Boy, I sure wouldn't like to be Laura or Jack tomorrow if Edward ever found out." Turning, Edward left on a gale of their shared laughter and went back to his office. Coffee forgotten. His wife was cheating on him. Had apparently been doing it for a long time. At that moment Edward was numb. He sat there behind his desk with his head in his hands, staring at the desktop. Then slowly all the questions started running through his head. How could she do this to me? What's wrong with me? Am I that bad a lover that she needs to find it elsewhere? Does our marriage mean nothing to her? How could she toss 10 years of marriage down the crapper without a thought? Then the anger came. She wanted to play around? Well, fine then, but she would have to pay the consequences. It was then that the germ of the plan began to form in his mind. A slow smile came across his face. Yes, things would be different in the Bishop house soon. Very soon indeed. Edward finished off his beer, threw a tin on the bar and got up and headed for the door. He had an appointment to keep at his house. It was 4.30 and he was supposed to be in Portland until tomorrow, meeting with potential investors at the Embassy Suites. He had called Paul Richardson that morning and got him to go in his place. Paul was his executive assistant, as well as his partner in the business, and would be more than happy to prove his worth on this money-finding trip. Meanwhile, Edward did all the usual things a cucked husband did: empty the savings account, cashed in the CDs and empties the safety deposit box. Luckily, they had a prenuptial agreement or Laura would get half the business. Just to be sure, he got a copy of that too out of the office safe and planned to include it in the divorce papers. Then he had gone to Sammy's and sat and drank and contemplated his plan. Laura Bishop sighed contentedly as Jack Sullivan's lips grazed over her. Nobody does me like you do, she murmured into his thick hair. Never mind all that, I want you now, Laura said, pulling him up. Jack grinned. Your wish is my command, my little married 304. But before he could do anything, there was an ominous crunch. Sound in the voice of Edward Bishop said, "Well, isn't this cozy?" from the doorway. Laura shrieked and fell off the bed. Jack stood shocked. He spun around and lost his balance, falling off the other side of the bed. He looked ludicrous like a turtle on his back. "Seems my loving wife has been very naughty indeed," said Edward in a calm, almost gentle voice, advancing into the room with a 10-gauge shotgun cradled in his hands, pointed straight at Jack, who was frantically trying to scramble off the floor and cover up his nakedness at the same time. "Edward, it isn't what you think." "Be quiet, Laura," Edward said in his new calm and gentle voice, not looking at her, but gaze trained steadily on Jack, who was standing, back against the wall and hands over his crotch, cringing away from the barrel of the shotgun, which looked roughly the diameter of a drainpipe. "But Edward," I said, "be quiet," Edward said in his calm and gentle voice. "You'll get your turn soon enough, my darling wife. It's time for me and old Jackie here to have a serious discussion now. What are you going to do?" Edward ignored Jack's question and continued to stand there, cradling the shotgun and looking at him interestedly, like he was a new bug on a microscope. "You like to screw other men's wives," he said conversationally, as if he had said something of no more importance than "it's going to rain today." "It wasn't my idea," Jack babbled. "She came on to me and you like to screw other men's wives and it makes you feel like a right old tomcat and lady killer, doesn't it, Jackie old chum? Makes you feel like you still got the stuff. Makes you feel like you still got what it takes. Isn't that right, my good little buddy?" Jack said nothing, but continued to stare at the gun. Edward deliberately moved his hand to the trigger. Yes, whatever you say," Jack screamed, a jet of urine spurting out of him. "Well now, that's good," said Edward, still sounding conversational and ignoring the small puddle at Jack's feet. "And you could have gone right on feeling that way, except you picked the wrong man's wife to screw, my friend." "Edward, please, can't we talk about this?" Laura asked, huddled in a trembling heap on the side of the bed. "One more time, Laura. Be quiet or I'll gag you," Edward said, still not looking at her. "Now, you like to screw other men's wives. We already established that," Edward said, still addressing a trembling Jack. "But you also like to screw other men's wives and especially my wife. I can't let that go unpunished, good buddy," Edward said. The tone was regretful, but Jack could have sworn he saw sadistic glee floating in the man's eyes. "Walk with me, Jack old buddy. And Laura, you sit right there and don't move. You're in enough trouble already. You mind me now?" Laura didn't answer as Edward led Jack out the bedroom door, but continued to sit there as directed. Edward thought he would have to carry Jack. His knees were shaking so bad, he could almost feel sorry for the son of a bitch, had he not caught him doing what he was doing. He prodded Jack into the kitchen, where there was a coil of chain and a pair of handcuffs dangling from a ring bolt in the wall. "Snapped the bracelets on, old chum," he said, prodding Jack in the back with the barrel of the shotgun. Jack squeaked and jerked away from the touch of the cold metal and hurriedly snapped the handcuffs on. Edward was mildly disgusted. The guy didn't even try to fight. Why was Laura cavorting with this a-hole? Because the length of chain was so short. Once Jack had snapped the cuffs on, he was left bending over the counter on his toes. "Now, since you like to screw my wife, I think it time I did you the same favor. Allow me to introduce you to Mr. Remington. You're about to get to know him very well," said Edward amiably. Jack heard the thud of his boots advancing across the kitchen, and he began to bawl. "Please, Mr. Bishop. I'm sorry. Please don't do it," he blubbered, snot and tears dripping onto the counter. Edward ignored him, but allowed a slight grimace of distaste to cross his face. "God, what a chicken." Jack began whipsawing wildly, trying to break the hole the cuffs had on him, but succeeded only in banging his face on the counter. He glanced fearfully over his shoulder and saw Edward looming up behind him, the shotgun glistening in his hands. The barrel looked bigger than a drainpipe now. It looked like a light pole aiming for his butt. And then, without a word, it went in 3 inches. Jack screamed. He screamed very loudly indeed. It withdrew and slammed him again, eliciting another scream. Blood glistened on the end of the barrel as Edward slammed it in one more time. "You like screwing my wife," he said into Jack's ear, his hot breath sounding like a bull getting ready to charge. "How do you like it, my good little friend? Is Mr. Remington taking good care of you? Is he?" Jack screamed and cried, and Edward grinned. His face hanging over Jack's shoulder reflected in the gleaming pots in front of him like a Halloween mask. Jack prayed for it to be over. The pain was excruciating, and he just wanted it to stop. Mercifully, it did. Edward withdrew the shotgun barrel and stood back, studying Jack dispassionately as he hung from his now bleeding wrists and sobbed. "Like that, old buddy? Like getting screwed? Is it as marvelous from the other end as you seem to think it must be?" She asked for it. Honest, she did. Jack whimpered. Edward ignored this. "You're gonna think twice about screwing another man's wife. Isn't that right?" "Yes, whatever you say, Edward," Jack said, now seeing a ray of hope for getting out of this alive. "Well, that's fine then," said Edward. "But you still have one more lesson to learn, my friend. Please let me go, Edward. I'll leave town, lick your shoes, whatever you say, just let me go." "Oh no, we're not done yet. You still have to learn," Edward said soothingly, as though talking to a child. He came around and unlocked the handcuffs, not troubling to stay out of Jack's reach. The little a-hole wouldn't do anything. "Turn around, Jack. You still have to say hi to Mr. Remington." Jack turned. The pain was now secondary to his fear. He was sure he was about to die. The shotgun barrel loomed in front of him. "Open your mouth." Now trembling more violently still, Jack opened his mouth and Edward slid the barrel in. Jack nearly vomited, but held it in. He was sure mild-mannered Edward Bishop had gone insane, and he didn't want to do anything else to provoke him. So he closed his eyes and held on to the counter behind him. "Open your eyes, Jack. Open them now," Edward said, almost crooning. Slowly Jack opened his eyes. The barrel felt slimy and oily and dirty in his mouth. Edward's red hand grasped the stock. His finger moved deliberately toward the trigger. Jack watched in horrid fascination as it crept inch by inch. "He's about ready to come." Edward crooned at Jack, staring directly into his eyes as his finger inched toward the trigger. "Can't you feel him pulsing? Getting ready to blow at you, Jackie? Can you feel it? See how wonderful this can be, you son of a bitch." And then Edward's finger found the trigger and pulled it. There was a click. The gun wasn't loaded, but Jack fainted dead away, collapsing onto the floor, his bladder letting go all at once. He came around a couple seconds later, sure he was dead. And then, the tip of Edward's steel-toed workboat slammed into his nuts, and he felt nothing but fiery agony bellowing up from his crotch and into his belly. "Get out of here once you got your wind back," Edward said, administering one final savage kick to Jack's ribs. "If I still find you here once I get back from dealing with my loving wife, I'll load the gun for real and shoot me a trespasser." Jack nodded as best he could and crawled toward the door. He was still naked, but all he wanted right then was to get away from this madman. Edward turned away from the writhing mass on the floor and headed deliberately for the stairs. He had a loving wife to visit. Laura was still sitting there on the side of the bed. She had heard Jack's screams echoing up the stairs, but hadn't dared move. In all the years she had been married to Edward, she had never once been afraid of him. She was terrified now. Edward stood and leaned against the closet door, as far away from Laura as he could get. "Why, it was all," he said. "What did you do to Jack?" Laura asked. "You're in no position to ask questions. Why did you cheat on me?" Laura started crying at the pure venom she heard in his voice. "Edward, I love you. Can't we be reasonable about this? You brought a bunch of men into our house and screwed them on our bed, you bitch. Why did you do that? You answer my questions and maybe I'll think about answering yours." He didn't raise his voice and his biting words were all the more compelling for that. "It was just sex. I just wanted something different. You weren't supposed to find out," she babbled, hunching in on herself. "I never wanted to hurt you, Edward, honest." "Well, that's just grand, isn't it?" Edward said, pacing in a big circle and clenching his fists. "You didn't want to hurt me and I wasn't supposed to find out. You wanted to have your cake and eat it too. And who gives a shit if you toss our marriage down the goddamn drain? Isn't that right? Hell, you're not even sorry for cheating. You're only sorry you got caught. Laura could only sob. How could she tell him that it was the thrill of the chase, the excitement of strange men that motivated her? She loved Edward. She really did. But he could only give her so much. But Edward had figured it out, and he crushed all hope of reconciliation with his next statement. It's not even the sex for you, is it, Laura? I mean, Jack Sullivan? He's a stupid accountant. It's the cheap thrill for you. Isn't that right? Laura said nothing but continued to cry. You disgust me, Edward said, slumping as though all the fight had gone out of him. He really had loved this woman once. Would have done anything for her. You threw your marriage away because you can't remember that you're a grown-up and not 16 anymore. Get dressed and get the hell out of here. Maybe you can kiss Jack Sullivan all better, he sneered, leaving the room and heading downstairs. Sure enough, Jackie boy was gone, leaving only a trail of blood behind. Goddamn spineless. Edward cleaned it up, listening with half an ear as Laura scurried around upstairs, hopefully packing a bag. He took the ring bolt off the wall and brought it back into the garage with the chain and cuffs and stored them back in his toolbox. He had let the inner animal out, the one who was always in charge back in his gang days when there was a rumble on, and putting him back to sleep was tough. His hands shook and his head throbbed. When he got back in, Laura was heading out the front door with a suitcase. She threw him a sad look, which he ignored before closing it, more tears staining her cheeks. Stupid, faithless bitch. Edward never heard from her directly again. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized. Jack Sullivan had vanished, leaving Washington behind without a trace. Laura fled to California, and word reached Edward through his contacts that she had taken up the life of a biker groupie. During the divorce proceedings, Laura bombarded Edward's voicemail with countless messages, pleading with him to reconsider. She promised to change, begged for another chance, and even offered assurances that he could set the terms to keep her in line. But Edward refused to entertain the idea. Once trust was shattered, it was gone for good. He knew there would be no rebuilding it, no way to erase the doubts. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life questioning every missed call, every late night, or every suspicious mark on her clothes. Instead, he deleted her messages and let the lawyers handle everything. When it was finally over, Edward's life returned to its usual rhythm. His business continued to thrive, and he kept up his habit of joining his crews on job sites. Yet, a nagging question lingered in the back of his mind. How many of these guys had Laura been with? It was a question he never dared to investigate, preferring the peace of ignorance over the torment of knowing.